Basilides was an early Gnostic Christian from the city of Alexandria in Egypt. It's believed this teaching started around the year 117, and it runs through about the late 130s. And this happens to correspond to or overlap with the same time that Valentinus becomes a Christian, or at least some version of a Christian, maybe Gnostic Christianity, because he likely was influenced by Basilides before he moved off to Rome. So it's not only Basilides, but also the man named Serdo, who was also connected to Valentinus. And the roots of this particular teaching seem to be embedded more in line with what would be known as classical Gnosticism. It's moving away from classical Gnosticism, closer in toward Christianity as time goes on. His views, however, are slightly different than classic Gnosticism, and they're also different than Valentinus and Marcion that would come later. And it's sort of emblematic of what was going on in the early church with these various Gnostic teachers. All of them gained quite a foothold in the various geographies where they were located. However, there's something sort of striking that stands out. All of the Gnostic teachers seem to have quite different views. In fact, some of them are really not compatible with one another, which is a lot different than the way that these proto-Orthodox teachers who would become the Orthodox, those who were affirmed at the Council of Nicaea later would be. They're not as uniform. There's not really more than one person, or more than one teacher rather, who has the same exact teachings. They're all quite different, and generally based upon their own philosophy or their own writings. He claimed to get his teachings from Matthias, none other than the Apostle Matthias, that is chosen by lot in the book of Acts. He said that Matthias explained sort of the secrets, the better way of understanding the world and the real teachings of Jesus. In other words, he's fairly in line with most of the Gnostic teachers at the time. All of them picked an apostle and said this one had the actual correct teaching about who Jesus was, and he was no different. In fact, he was using what's known as the Gospel of Matthias. Now, we don't have a writing, or some people claim it's the Traditions of Matthias, which is maybe a different book, maybe the same book. Nevertheless, it really doesn't survive to the modern era, except in a few small quotes that's maybe by Clement of Alexandria and Origen. And it makes sense that those two would be writing against Basilides, since they were also from Alexandria. But in addition to that, he creates what's known as the Gospel of Basilides. In other words, his own version of the truth about Jesus. And he uses it alongside the Gospel of John. Specifically not Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It appears that they were too human for Basilides to use. They were in opposition to the Gnostic tendencies that he had. Now, this is again quite different than others who would come later, who used Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or one of them, or used some combination of them, maybe in a sense of a gospel harmony of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He used John specifically because John is more mystical. Jesus is more divine in the way that he's presented there, and it fit better with his Gnostic theology. Like some of the other Gnostic teachers, he also uses the Apostle Paul, or at least pieces of the scriptures of the Apostle Paul. None of the books in whole, I don't believe. They were just sort of excerpts from the Apostle Paul. And so using those along with the Gospel of John, and in addition, the Gospel of Basilides, and at least 24, it looks like, other books known as the Exegetica. Now, the Exegetica were said to be commentaries on the Gospel. Now, either the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Basilides, or maybe both. And there were various sections of the Exegetica that were written, and that's what comprises the some 24 books that he wrote. And we have various quotations that have come down to us from various authors who were writing against Basilides in the early church, people like Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Clement, and Alexander, and Origen, and various others too, like Tertullian. In order to understand his view on who Jesus was, who the Christ was, we kind of have to dig into his cosmology a bit. And as stated before, it's more of the classical kind of understanding of Gnosticism. Basilides believed in a unmoved or uncreated God, and so in that sense he was a bit more monistic rather than dualistic in the way that he saw the world. There weren't various evil gods. There was a creator God who emanated things from him, but this God was sort of the opposite of the way that it's described in the biblical literature and in Jewish and Christian literature as a living God. He is, in a sense, he exists outside of existence, which seems to be a very mystical kind of way of understanding God. In fact, it's been described as a not being God. God is a not being God rather than a living God or a being God. He's a not being God. And that, in fact, is his claim of what the real intention of Gnosticism is to get back to that initial state. In some way, you have to get back to the not being part. In order to do that, though, you have to escape this world. And this world, you see, was created after a series of emanations. And so you have these various archons who are ruling these various different heavens. And so you have the initial creation, right, which is a sort of first level of heaven, and then those emanate another generation or another layer, and it's the second heaven, and so on. And we go all the way through 365 different emanations and 365 levels of heaven to make it all the way back up to where the not being God is, the one who exists outside of existence. In this way, then, the Creator God is not necessarily evil. It's just this bottom level angel who partners with others to create the world as almost an emanation of itself. In fact, he states that evil and sin and suffering aren't things that happen because of moral choices. They're rather implicit in nature itself. In other words, it has to be that way. It's part and parcel with what it means to be a part of the physical universe. So then the Jewish God is one of these lower level angels from the 365th level of heaven. And his views are essentially not compatible with the God who is the not being God. And so Christ then is an emanation or the son of the not being God who's come into the world in order to lead people out of this place so that they can make their way back eventually to this final state, which is in the not being realm, the existence beyond existence. And that's really what ought to be strived for. And so his gospel contains information about this. And he also picks apart the Gospel of John and trying to decipher it in this way. And so therein lies his claim to fame as a mutilator of Scripture, or at least in the understanding of Scripture and the hermeneutics in the way that it was generally practiced in the early church. He was far outside of people even like Origen. And Origen is already on the edge of orthodoxy in the way that he interpreted many pieces of Scripture, especially using the allegorical method. But many of these Gnostic teachers would layer many teachings one upon another, one allegory on an allegory on an allegory. As is the case with Valentinus as well, Jesus comes and appears to suffer, appears to be a man. In other words, he has docetic theology, that Jesus isn't really physical in any way. And in fact, his form changes, especially at the time of the crucifixion, where, just as Valentinus stated, that he changed places with Simon of Cyrene in order that Simon of Cyrene was crucified rather than Jesus, as Jesus stood by laughing and mocking those who had, in fact, crucified the wrong person. And he's laughing and mocking them because of their ignorance about the world. Hence the term gnosis, right? Knowledge. If you have knowledge, you can be free from all these various different ways of seeing the world. And there was another piece of his theology, metempsychosis, which states that you could be punished in this life for sins that may have been caused or begun in another life. So even the Christian martyrs, or those who would go to their death for whatever reason, any kind of pain or suffering that you would have to endure, it may not be sins directly in this life, but sins at some point in time. And because he believed in what he called transmigrations. And these transmigrations are essentially reincarnation. So you would die and then be rebirthed in some other soul to live out your life in another way. And you may have to pay for the sins of the past in that life. But eventually with gnosis, you see, you could graduate yourself to get to the point where you could be in the ultimate state. And that ultimate state was away from sin and suffering and death and all the other problems, especially the problems like desire and lust and these things. And you'd be freed from them by knowledge. However, once you got to the final plane of existence, once you got to that place where the not being God was, he would cover you with a blissful ignorance, which seems counterintuitive since the entire foundation is based upon knowledge, upon the gnosis that someone has. But that knowledge is used just to get to that point so that God could then cover you with a blissful ignorance. But it's not general ignorance. It's ignorance over the things of the world that are difficult, like sin and suffering and shame and lust and desire and all the rest. That was really the ultimate goal. It's sort of like in the movie The Matrix, right? He wanted to get blue-pilled again and be reinserted into the Matrix in order that he wouldn't actually know the truth about the way that there were beings who were out there who were suffering, who were hurting, or who were desiring any kind of thing in the world. Basilides never formed an actual formal school like many of the other Gnostics did. However, his teaching did outlast him after his death because his son Isidore picked up those teachings. Now, he did alter them slightly, and in some places he seems to contradict what his father believed. But those teachings also lived on in places like Valentinus, who carries it to Rome, and possibly through the teachings of Marcion and many others. And eventually, all of these faded out into a movement known as Manichaeism, which we'll get to at some point in this series. But his thoughts come from somewhere too. They didn't just pop into existence at that moment. There was a basis for this thought. And at some point we'll have to discuss that and understanding where these Gnostic teachings come from and why are they present in these various different areas where Jews and Christians resided. So this is important, but nonetheless, Basilides leaves his mark on the world as a mutilator of Scripture and as a heretic in the early church.